Aloha, I'm your host Hilary Weinberg, and this is The Whole Gamut. I'm here with two HPU professors to talk about something that's very important, climate change. The COP21 is coming up soon, at COP20, and we're here to talk about it. So this is Professor Regina and Professor Dave. How are you guys doing today?
Very good, thank you. Nice to be here.
So Regina, you're a professor of environmental science, and your background is environmental economics. Can you talk about that just briefly for the audience?
Sure. So I'm an associate professor of environmental science, but I teach environmental economics, which means how do you put a price on clean air and clean water and different aspects of our life that our environment affects us, but how do you actually put a price on those things?
Great, and Dave, you're a professor of marine science, associate professor, and what's your passion and focus?
So paleoceanography is probably my biggest passion and focus, which is reconstructing past changes in ocean climate. And so looking at natural variability, which we need to understand in order to understand the warming trend and what is a warming trend and what is natural variability.
Well, and what a natural segue into the first part of our show, which we're going to talk about the science of climate change and why this is something that so many people around the world take very seriously. So as an oceanographer and paleoceanography, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what changes do you see?
Yeah, if we think locally, this summer is a great example, right? It seems like our summers, and especially August, is getting warmer every year. And maybe last year was really warm. Maybe it was because the trade winds were light. And so it's an interesting question. There's this just sort of an unusual physical phenomenon, this light trade winds that is resulting in these really warm August, or is it global warming? Or maybe another way to think of it is a combination of the two.
Right.
So we know there's natural variability, we know there's global warming, and so it looks like we're seeing that, it's starting to see that expression just in our own climate here on island.
Yeah, and something that I always learned about climate change is that's very important to keep track of is the difference between climate and weather.
Absolutely.
So can you, in your field, can you explain the differences and why that difference is so important?
Well, there's a fun phrase which is climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. To break that down, climate is sort of the statistical averages. So, we think that in August it's going to be warmer, it's going to be in the 80s or 90s, and then in January it's going to be colder. And any given day might have this much rainfall, and so weather is just that. Some days it's rainy and
Right.
some days it's not. So sort of climate is the long-term averages and weather is what we have any given day.
Yeah. So in your research, what have you found that shows the difference in the climate over the past, well, how far back does your research go then?
Anywhere from thousands of years to hundreds of years is the time scale I focus mostly on.
Mm-hmm.
But of course other people go back millions of years.
Yeah.
And so one of the interesting things that I've found in taking sediment cores off the coast of California, for example, is that the ocean ecosystem began to change there before we were all born. So in the early 20th century, we already began to see more species that prefer warmer waters, more tropical species than were there historically for the centuries and millennium, so hundreds and thousands of years prior. So it looks we're really departing from this typical natural variability, before the 1950s, before we were born. And so our baseline, what we think of as usual, is a little bit skewed because what we think of as usual is already been affected by a warming trend.
So first let's explain, talk about what sediment cores are and why they're so important to the study of climate change.
Absolutely. So we have little plankton in the ocean, and some of them have hard parts, calcium carbonate, like coral reefs. And when they die, they sink to the bottom along with all the other sediments kind of falling through the ocean, and they form these layers in the bottom where we take the sediment cores. There's no oxygen, so things are very well preserved. So as things sort of accumulate and build these layers up through time, we come in and we take a sediment core and then bring that back to the lab and sift through the different layers and examine the changes that have happened through time via the fossils and the sediments.
So what have you seen? So why do scientists believe that these sediment cores can show us how the climate has changed? I mean, clearly they're showing the different plankton and different microorganisms, but what, this shows that it's human climate change, not just natural, as many people believe.
Yeah, so that's a good question. There's a whole broad range of different evidence. So what we get, for example, from the sediment cores is really just part of the whole picture, right? So there's our theory and expectations from what greenhouse gases are, and then there's just observations of temperature change from thermometers from the last 150 years or so. And then there's these paleo records like sediment cores and ice cores that define how climate changed in the past. And there's lots of natural climate variability, right? And so looking at natural variability through time, we see that a lot of these patterns in the warming trend we're seeing is quite unusual. And that is just further reiterates the link to our activities in greenhouse gases.
So I'm not sure if you've worked on this, but a really important piece of science that has determined a lot of climate change research is the sediment cores coming from Antarctica. What do you know about them, either of you, and can you explain to our audience why these are so important?
Yeah, the Antarctic ice cores go back hundreds of thousands of years. And in fact, one several years ago was the longest to date, and I think it went back about 750,000 years. And what we've seen through these really long Antarctic ice cores is that CO2 levels have not been anywhere near what they are today for nearly 1 million years. In other words, we've gone through all these big glacial cycles of the ice age advance, and then it retreats, and sea level gets over 100 meters lower, and then it comes closer to the sea level that it is today. And so we see these huge changes, but at no point in nearly the last 1 million years has CO2 been even close to as high as it is today. You'd have to go back just about to the age of the dinosaurs to see that type of climate, and we're the reason why CO2 levels are rising.
So let's get really to the basics of the science of climate change. So what does CO2 have to do with the warming climate?
CO2 and climate, and how does that work? The simple analogy is the greenhouse effect, of course. So CO2 is in the atmosphere and it prevents heat from escaping, much like a greenhouse. Another way of thinking about it is the amount of energy coming in has to equal energy going out for our little, now we think of the Earth as a little tiny dot in space, right? And whatever's coming in from the sun, that same amount has to leave, and so greenhouse gases prevent that heat from leaving. So you have two options. Well, one option really. You heat up until you can get enough heat to leave to what's coming in. So the greenhouse is the simple analogy, and that's the another way of thinking about it. Fundamentally, it's the laws of physics. Right? And so that analogy is based on Planck's law. Much like the law of gravity, these laws are, nature always abides by them. So it's based on the idea of global warming, based on greenhouse gases, is really strongly grounded in the laws of physics, where if you prevent heat from leaving the atmosphere, the planet has to heat up in order for there to be a balance.
Great, wow. So we have to cut to a commercial break already. However, there's so much to talk about. And I'm really excited. When we get back, we're going to talk more about the science of climate change, what it means for our oceans and for Hawaii, and what is this COP anyway? Back in a minute.
Here's the deal. I'm Jay Fidel. I'm the host of Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, which is the Energy Policy Forum's program on Wednesday. That's how we call Wednesday Energy Wednesday. We call it Energy Wednesday every Wednesday. Are you surprised? Okay, and we try to get guys like Jim Alberts here from Hawaiian Electric who can tell us what's really going on in energy. We want to be informed. It's so important. It's the most important initiative in our state. Clean energy is major, okay? And that's how we cover it on this show. That's the deal. What do you think, Sharon?
I think that's great. That's why we're here every Wednesday from 4 to 5, and we hope you all join us so we can hear people like Jim coming on our show and co-host Ray Starley from Hawaii Energy.
Okay, Jim, you've been here today. You've seen this. You heard what she said. What do you think?
I think it's a tremendous opportunity for people to come together and talk about the issues. Oftentimes, there isn't a good forum to bring these key issues out into the public, and this is a tremendous way to go about it. And the activity of this show is essential to keep talking about energy because, as you said, it's such an essential part of our lives that we need to pay attention to it and we need to think about the future.
Okay, Ray, your turn.
Well, this is a special time in the history of Hawaii where we're making some pretty radical changes in the way we use energy and generate energy. And this show is the one place you can count on coming to every Wednesday and hearing something about the latest issues that are on the table, being discussed, that will affect us all going forward. So come join us, and if you have some ideas you want to share with us about energy, give us a call and let us know. We'll put you up here and let you talk for an hour. So come see us.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Jim. It's great to be, from ThinkTech's point of view, it's great to have this show. We love the show. It's our most important show. So come around and listen to us 4 to 5 on Wednesday. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Aloha, welcome back to the whole gamut. Right before a commercial break, I was talking to these two amazing professors from HPU about climate change and why it's so important to us and what the heck the COP21 is. But before we even get to that part of it, we were talking about breaking down the science of climate change. And before we cut to commercials, we were talking about what the sediment cores were and Antarctic cores, the Arctic cores. And now my question is, okay, you're talking about CO2. It's so important. What does that have to do with us? What does that have to do with humans, and how are we affecting the climate?
Yeah, so it's carbon dioxide, all this great energy in oil, for example, and gas, and we put that in the car and combust it. It combines with oxygen, and the byproduct is CO2, which is harmless for us to breathe, but of course accumulates in the atmosphere. If there was no CO2, our climate and the planet would be much colder and much less hospitable. But given that we are adding large amounts of CO2 to the atmosphere, as well as methane and some other greenhouse gases, that is having the result of this greenhouse effect, which is in fact warming our climate.
Mm-hmm. And of course, CO2 is coming from us combusting oil, coal, natural gas, and this is a result of our increased car use, using it for electricity. I mean, in China, coal is still the main source of electricity, and there's so many byproducts from these, amazing sources that have allowed us to industrialize and become modern societies. However, they are causing a lot of problems. So let's kind of start talking about, what are the problems that climate change is causing? I mean, why is it a big deal to just a few, degrees Fahrenheit?
Mm-hmm.
So why is this so important? And, okay, we have an oceanographer with us. Why does this affect the ocean, and what does that have to do with me?
Yeah, some of the big changes we're going to see changing patterns of precipitation. We do have a long-term decline in rainfall. You wouldn't have guessed it this summer, but there is a long-term decline. Whether that will continue in Hawaii in the future or not is kind of an uncertainty. Rainfall patterns will certainly change in other areas of the globe, growing seasons, the amount of ice in the Arctic. And one of the things that I think really we'll most definitely see in Hawaii in the future is rising sea level. So sea level rise is going to be this big signal that we're pretty much guaranteed. Now, how much we're going to see is less clear, but we're going to see the ocean rise. And that's going to affect all of us who live on island, especially people who live close to the beach or even like to go to the beach.
So, okay, so the sea level rise, but again, all right, just the sea, it's rising a little bit. What long-term effects does that have, on Hawaii, economically, socially? I mean, as a background, this is something I work on, but just for the audience, let's talk about that. What's so important?
It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, I think, because we already see so many issues, particularly with homeowners, the sand at Waikiki, and as sea level rises, these issues are just going to be more compounded. So are we going to build more seawalls to protect homes along the coast and infrastructure that we have? And then we're going to, if so, are we going to lose these sand and beaches? And beaches are part of Hawaii, so what are we going to do? People who live on the coastline, I think one of the things that we're starting to see already, we'll certainly see more in the future, is their cost of insurance will go up. And as people's cost of insurance goes up, even if they can get it, depending where they live, depending on how far we go out into the future and how fast sea level rises, we're going to see this issue come out. And I'm not sure how, the estimates of how much sea level rise are varied. It might be anywhere from a foot to 2 feet in the next 50 to 100 years. So we're really talking about our lifetimes.
So, and what about this past summer, there was 2 storms that almost hit Hawaii. Is this normal? Is this caused in part by climate change? I mean, these Pacific hurricanes?
Yeah, excellent question. So we have a really large El Nino event, and El Nino is a form of natural climate variability. Whether El Ninos are becoming more intense and more frequent is yet another question where there's ideas but no conclusions yet. But it could be a precursor. I think that there is some aspect of you sort of need the El Nino changes in the atmosphere to really get these intense tropical storm and hurricane seasons like we've had. But I think there's also an expectation that we will see more tropical storm and hurricane activity in the future.
So Regina, and Regina teaches environmental economics, so what are the economic impacts on Hawaii?
I think Dave characterized really, really well about sea level rise. You could also talk about impacts on Hawaii for the coral reefs, right, for ocean acidification and coral reef bleaching and things like that. And so from our point of view in Hawaii, it's a case of damages suffered versus damages caused. So we know that Hawaii is extremely dependent on fossil fuels, that we rely on fossil fuels almost entirely to generate our electricity and our energy. So that in turn creates CO2 that we put up into the atmosphere. But Hawaii is also very unique because we're an island, we're going to be particularly susceptible and vulnerable to the changes from climate change. So I think the externalities that are caused, that's what we call it in environmental economics, or the externalities or the byproducts of burning all the fossil fuels we're going to feel it here. One of the things, Dave, that you mentioned is in terms of sea level rise or increased cost of homeowners insurance. There'll be other increased costs, what we call defensive expenditures, meaning do we build seawalls, do we build other things, do we innovate with technology? Those are costs that are going to be evident once the sea level rise becomes more impinging upon our island. That you can talk about the damage to coral reefs and subsistence fishing, or even just any, the fisheries, the impacts on the economy from that perspective as well, not just in Hawaii, but around the world for people who rely on that for food. So there's many, many different ways that you can look at what the potential costs could be that are related to climate change, and there's a whole huge discipline that's related to that. It's very elusive, but there's a lot of work that's being done on it.
Absolutely. So, a question with the rising sea levels, a lot of the other Pacific islands, including Tuvalu, which is the greatest example, are really being affected by these rising seas much quicker than Hawaii is. And do you think there's going to be increased migration from these Pacific Island countries to Hawaii?
Most likely, it's already happening. So we're seeing, in particular, Australia and New Zealand have programs in place where they're already accepting many migrants. In fact, they have programs to accept some of the first waves of migrants so that they can set up homes and communities, and then their extended families can come later. So there's a lot of planning and thought has been put into this in terms of some areas of the Pacific and Indian Ocean. And certainly other parts of the U.S. territories will be facing a lot of these issues as well. So I think it's safe to say that we can expect that in the future.
Yeah. Let's talk about some impacts of climate change beyond Hawaii. I mean, one thing that comes to mind are the increased hurricanes on the East Coast. I mean, you look at what happened with Hurricane Sandy a few years ago in New York. There's people in parts of New York City that still haven't recovered their homes, that they're still, FEMA and other federal agencies are still grappling with how to deal with a crisis like this. And what are your guys' thoughts on how our country will evolve to be able to handle increased weather change? And this isn't just the hurricanes on the East Coast. There's been droughts in the center of the country. There's been increased tornado activity, and climate change affects all of this because if you heat the climate as a whole, weather systems become more and more intense. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, my prediction is that whatever we do, it's going to be about 20 or 30 years too late. But aside from that, since I don't think that was necessarily your question, curious that you say on the East Coast, because with El Nino years, the East Coast actually gets less hurricanes. So actually the insurance companies don't mind El Nino because even though there's lots of damage on the West Coast, the chances of hurricanes on the East Coast for that year are less. But we're really talking about the future trends. And hurricanes are not expected to be more frequent globally, but they are expected, as you mentioned, to be more intense. And that's a really good question. I'm not sure how our society is going to react other than maybe too late. I'm not sure.
I would say maybe I'm more Pollyannish than you are, but I don't think that it's too late. But I do believe that, back to the COP21 that you mentioned earlier, Hilary, this really focuses on one of the major accomplishments that should come out of COP21. And from the United States point of view, how do you put a price on carbon? How do you put a price on the fact that the carbon dioxide is being emitted and these externalities are being caused? How can we put a price on that to try to offset the costs that it's creating for us? And it has to be done internationally. It's not just something that can be done in the United States, even though we're one of the largest emitters. It has to be done through an international forum. So I think that maybe, I still have some hope that what comes out of COP21 will be, putting us in the right direction, that we can agree on commitments individually as countries, but we can also agree on different funding mechanisms, on different programs that can be used to help not just with damage in the United States, but there are other countries, particularly, poor countries and developing countries, that will be even more at risk and more vulnerable to the changes in climate change.
And there's something called, some people have coined the term committed climate change. So what we've done to date in terms of what we've emitted, we've committed to climate change for the next 30 or 40 years. So we can't change that too much. But on the other hand, whatever we do in the next 20 or 30 or 40 years is going to be our commitment to climate change 40 or 50 years later. So there's these ongoing, the Earth is going to, regardless of what we do today, the Earth is going to keep warming and do some things. Sea level's going to rise, but what we do in the next couple decades will affect several decades later quite a bit. So.
Absolutely. So again, unfortunately, we're finally getting into the good stuff, and we have to cut to another commercial break. But we'll be right back. See you then.
Aloha, my name is Justina Spiritu, and I'm the co-host of Hawaii Farmers Series. This is my co-host, Matthew Johnson, and you can catch us every Thursday at 4 p.m. at thinktechhawaii.com. What do we talk about, Matt?
So on Hawaii Farmers Series, we're going to be bringing on the farmers and also supporter of farmers, including restaurants, caterers, as well as government supporters and nonprofits to hear their background stories and understanding our local ag community just a little bit better.
Yeah, essentially there's a lot more that goes into farming and the local food community beyond just producing the food. And we want to feature and get the background story on all these folks and see how we all work together as a community. So join us every Thursday. Aloha.
Welcome back to The Whole Gamut. My name is Hilary Weinberg. And again, before we continue with the show, don't forget we're on Twitter. So if you have any questions for our wonderful guests, we are at ThinkTech HI. So before the commercial break, we were talking about COP21, which is the Council of Parties, and it's a big meeting that's happening in Paris very soon. But Regina, can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Of course. It's the Conference of Parties. It's the 21st Conference of Parties, which is a meeting of all the partners, all the countries, and there's over 190 that are participating in COP21 in November. It starts November 30th. It's going to be 2 weeks in Paris. And it's all under the rubric of the UNFCCC. It's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it's been going on, well, this is the 21st one. They're yearly events. But this one is really key. Some of the previous COPs haven't necessarily delivered much on what they were supposed to deliver in terms of creating an international agreement that's binding to address climate change and to keep us within what people are predicting should be a 2 degrees Celsius limit over the average global temperature. So this coming up in Paris is going to be pivotal in terms of how the international community is going to deal with climate change.
So first of all, why is this 2 degrees Celsius? Why is this so important?
Well, you probably have an opinion on that as well, but how about I just explain it and then you can put your opinions. Okay. So 2 degrees Celsius was a number that scientists came up with several years ago that said if we're looking at the rise in the global average temperature, that beyond 2 degrees Celsius, that the costs that are involved or the damage that will be involved will be terrible, catastrophic. So if we can remain somehow within that 2 degrees Celsius, then it'll be feasible. And again, it became more of a policy decision to stick to 2 degrees because it was easy to think about, it was easy to kind of address. But there's controversy over whether it is 2 degrees Celsius, which relates to about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, or whether it needs to be much higher, or whether we've already gone beyond the fact that we would hit this 2 degree landmark kind of thing. So David, maybe you have a...
Yeah, in some part it's an even number, which
Yeah.
is just a little
Nice and
easier to
round.
work with. And I think, once you go over some certain points, we're so far from the climate that we grew up on that the uncertainty is overwhelming. But even the certainty in terms of sea level rise is already going to be, the economic costs are already going to be, about as much as we can deal with, and more than that is just scary.
So, all right, so they're aiming for this 2 degrees Celsius, and so what can an international forum like the COP do to prevent climate change?
Well, it's a good question, but the difference of this COP compared to previous COPs is that in previous times it was more of a top-down approach, that internationally they agreed upon different levels that we wanted to reduce emissions by. And in this one, it's a little different. It's more bottom-up, so that each country is coming with what they've committed to individually. It's what they've individually, in their own nation, committed to, and coming to the table. So I've heard an analogy that it's like a potluck, that everyone who's coming, every country that's coming is bringing what they can reasonably afford to do to address climate change, specifically reducing CO2 emissions. So for example, in the United States, Obama has committed to reducing our levels of CO2 below 2005 levels by about 26 to 28% by 2025. So that's an example. So China is bringing what they've determined is reliable for them, reasonable for them. India, same way with the other large emitters. All the countries are coming with their own contributions.
Interesting. So, and there has been some interesting bilateral agreements on climate change. I mean, the U.S. and China came to a very large bilateral climate change agreement. U.S. and India, is that correct? They recently did as well. So there's discussions. People are, I think, as these conversations continue over, hopefully, the COP21 will be very impactful. I'm personally skeptical because I had my little heart broken when I was during the COP15 a few years ago.
Right.
But it's so interesting that, that they're coming now, having already worked together, having already come to agreements. So, the question is, what's going to happen, right? Something that we were talking about earlier, before the show, was how Obama, this is kind of Obama's last hurrah with this COP, because next year he'll be a lame duck president by the COP. So what do you think he's going to do? And why do you think this is so important to him?
Well, I think it's important for him. This is his second term. In the first term, when he first came in, many people were hopeful that he would address climate change very productively, be very productive in his actions. And he was kind of stymied by the whole failure to put in place legislation for cap and trade, or all the debates that were going back and forth about that in the first term, under his first term. So it seemed that during this, if you look at it as an outsider, looking over his whole second term, that he's been trying to use his political capital to place himself very well in the negotiating seat for this international forum in terms of his climate action plan, the White House climate action plan that came out about a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, the clean power plan that's come out recently, which is looking to limit emissions from large energy facilities, basically coal. The fact that EPA is regulating CO2 as a pollutant is something that's really changed. So there's all these different types of, including the bilateral agreements that you've talked about as well. So really the White House has been trying to position itself, to put it in a very special position that Obama can force this issue, get some action on it.
Yeah, and really the timescales of climate change and politics don't lean them support each other, or timescale of politics doesn't really help resolve climate change, because climate change is long and the political cycle is relatively short compared to climate change timescale. So you have a high cost if you're a politician in terms of taking action, and the benefits are not seen really until, well, frankly, preventing less catastrophic changes decades in the future.
Right. How do you measure something that? How do you campaign on something?
How
How do you
can we measure
something that hasn't happened yet?
Well, I mean, there's a whole nother show. Maybe we can talk about the social cost of carbon. There's an idea, this important number that nobody really knows about, the social cost of carbon, and it's how you look into the future to see what the damage, credible damage would be in the future, and discount it back into present value so that you can compare it against your programs now, what you're spending your money on.
So summing up the costs of all these seawalls that are going to be built, and whatever costs are associated with homeowners whose homes are destroyed, and
the cost of energy, the cost of all the different types of things, and discounting it back so that we can look at it more in the present value, present day.
So you two are experts on climate change, and so what do you think the most impactful solution would be? One or two or three or most impactful solutions, and what do you think are some things that were definitely going to happen that we're not going to be looked back from? And I have my own thoughts on this too. I'm excited to talk about that.
Well, I'll start with your last question, and it just goes back to sea level rise. Sea level is going to keep rising, and I think the audience can just go down and think about how they use the ocean and where roads are around the island, close to sea level, and just think about how that's going to impact them. We could also talk about precipitation and other things, but with regards to the first question.
I think I'll take that. Well,
to
that's good.
Regina.
We're a good tag team here, right? So the first question in terms of what can come out of this that I think is hopeful is investment in renewable energy. I mean, I think if this is the time and this is the place that if one thing were to come out of this COP21, it would be where the realization that we have very limited options and we need to start putting our money where the options are. And renewable energy is definitely, investing in renewable energy is going to be one of the top things. And who knows, it could create a whole different change in the market. So that the demand for renewable energy, not just talking about government subsidies or government funding or things like that, but that the market would actually help to create incentives for renewable energy.
Yeah, so one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is adaptation. How are we going to adapt to what's going to happen with the sea level rise? Is it going to be through changing, of course we need to reduce our carbon use, we need to do all these different things, but how do we change cities to, one, become less carbon centered, and two, how do we help them adapt? I mean, New York City is actually the city that's doing the most that I've seen. That really is, they're building seawalls, they're implementing, they're putting oysters back in the sound and the rivers, so it would create natural barriers. There's a lot of interesting things happening there.
And humans are so ingenious, really, for both good and bad. And so there's no doubt that we can adapt into many of the problems that we're going to face. I don't know about all of them. And it really comes down to is we can change things. We can build seawalls. We are going to have some negative effects. And ultimately what it comes down to is these are going to be costly, though. These are really, we're talking about enormous infrastructure changes for sea level. And they're going to be costly. And so from the from the economic perspective, these costs are going to be so high in the future that it would be much smarter to start to reduce emissions now.
And I think what I would add to that also is that many of the innovations or many of the solutions, technical solutions or management solutions that you would put into place that would be helpful for climate change or for adaptation are also just good environmental management decisions anyway. So many of them, there can be cost savings involved, there can be health benefits that come from it, there can be social benefits that come out of it. So you have to look for the solutions that are, yes, sure, we're addressing the impacts, the long-term impacts of climate change, but that what works best in our local place, in our city, with our societal elements that are taking place, and looking at different types of solutions and trying to get the co-benefits that can come from it as well.
Yeah, and one thing I want to touch on very briefly, we only have a minute or two left, is the refugee crisis and how there's a lot of connections, and we could do an entire show on this, but there are a lot of connections between desertification in sub-Saharan Africa and reduced water all over the Middle East and North Africa. And a lot of this is causing people, a lot of it's causing strife, it's causing economic debilitation, and it's causing war, and it's causing refugees. And so, of course, what happened with Paris, this is the other day, it circles back around. I mean, it's all interconnected.
Yeah. And I think if you're not convinced now, I mean, the parts of the Middle East have been becoming more arid, dry and arid for decades and centuries, really, since humans have been cutting down trees and things. But if you're not convinced yet, just give it a couple decades, right? And this comes back to that's going to be, I mean, now is probably, what we're seeing now is probably very small with regards to what we're going to see, which again, it goes back to the future economical costs of this. So.
And I think the irony of what you mentioned about what happened in Paris, and there's, you can read different blogs and different posts about how, is COP21 going to be canceled because of what happened in Paris? And emphatically, leaders came out and said, no, this is even more reason why we need to address this issue internationally and in this international forum, because exactly why. It comes down to energy security, it comes down to equity, it comes down to the whole climate refugees issue, so it really is critical, even more critical now.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys both for coming on the show. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Yes. So I'm your host, Hilary Weinberg, and this was ThinkTech Hawaii.